The Last of Us is a brilliant game. The Last of Us 2, well, it's even better. Welcome back. In the last video, we took a step back and looked at the Last of Us series as a whole. How it plays, how it's structured, the cordyceps-encrusted world in which it's set, and what it's trying to say when it's not forcing us into yet another needless shootout. And of course, we spent a lot of time with Joel. Naturally. The first game is his story, all wrapped up in fungal horror and paternal guilt. This time, though, we're shifting focus a little bit. This video is all about Ellie, her arc, her choices, and how the second game in particular turns her from a sidekick into something, well, more complicated. We're going to trace her journey across both games, from teenage wisecracker to someone who can barely recognize herself. Though, to be honest, we won't spend a lot of time in the first game. As I said in the first video, Ellie doesn't really get an arc in that first game. She's little more than Joel's cargo. And like in the first video, I've tried to balance the analysis with a little bit of dramatic storytelling, something hopefully entertaining. I tend to drift between the two styles, sometimes on purpose, but sometimes just because I got a little carried away with the thesaurus. Whether or not I struck the right balance this time, I genuinely don't know. But I gave it a shot, and if nothing else, it made for a weirdly emotional editing process. So there you go. Anyway, it's a long road ahead, so let's get into it. To eat my own words, as any good critic should, there's a stretch of the first game where Joel does recede. And maybe that's the best place to start if we want to talk about Ellie, not just as a sidekick or a foil, but as a person. Okay, so let's settle in. Winter. The world's gone quiet. Everything's covered in snow, thick enough to muffle sound and swallow colour. It's my personal favourite kind of weather for a good hike. The colour palette, the verdant greens of summer, the dull, sloughy greys that had transitioned to bright oranges across autumn, they fade. Replaced now by a soft blue and harsh, bright white. When the screen fades back in after Joel collapses at the university, it's Ellie we're left with. Alone for the first time in 15 hours, bow in hand, with no real idea of where she is or how long it's been. It's a pretty sharp shift in perspective. As I say, Joel isn't mentioned. We don't actually know if he's alive. Instead, the game has handed us control of Ellie, and it's not presented as a one-off section. It's not a gimmick. And on a first playthrough, this whole season lasted long enough that I was starting to think, maybe this is us now. Right away, it feels different. It feels like Ellie moves a little bit faster, but she's clearly smaller and more vulnerable than Joel ever felt. Her health bar is shorter, her weapon options are more limited, and all those upgrades and the skill points she'd been accumulating and spending with Joel, well, they're gone. Her melee attacks don't feel like they hit as hard. What I'm saying is you feel it, that you're not Joel anymore. Suddenly, that safety net that's been under you for hours is just not there. The opening moment with the rabbit feels almost too perfect in its foreshadowing for me to really comment on. One quick, clean kill. A small life, innocence, gone in a blink. Still, it might be obvious, but it sets the tone well. Survival is the only option, and it comes with a pretty grim cost. The player's first actions with Ellie is a hunt. A bounding buck. That great American rite of passage. Or at least, that's the way it's presented in films. As a British person, I have no idea if that's true to life. But if you'll allow me to stick with that imagery for just a second, I'd add that it's telling that Ellie is undertaking this hunt alone. There's no father gently guiding her first shot. This isn't God of War, after all. It's fittingly, I suppose, a longer hunt than the rabbit. Slower, more deliberate. A first unsteady shot. Blood flecks in the snow. Careful tracking. It's quiet, contemplative, and focused. Or at least I think that's the intention. Again, I'm not American, so I've never been hunting, but does it usually involve this much running? Still, it tells you something important. Ellie isn't just surviving here, she's providing for herself. She's stepped into a role she never asked for, and she's making it work. The blood trail eventually leads to an abandoned sawmill, and we're introduced to one of the most menacing characters in The Last of Us. A meek, calm, well-mannered man called David. When Ellie meets David, she's got the upper hand. Bow drawn and steady, voice firm, eyes locked and suspicious. She doesn't trust them. Of course she doesn't. Not after everything she's been through. She does all the right things in this first chance encounter. She disarms him, feigns being part of a larger group. There's great survival instincts she's clearly picked up on the long road we've been on. Even this early into the full Ellie arc, this is very different to the girl in Pittsburgh that wanted to stop for a wounded traveller. But still, there's this moment. Just a flicker, really, where her desperation slips through. She asks for medicine. Just that. It's just that it comes out a little too quick. It's subtle, and it's vulnerable. It's the first time we, the player, get a hint that Joel is still alive, and it's something that David clearly picks up on as a weakness. To the game's credit, David doesn't show his hand right away. He's not overtly evil in the initial meeting. There's no creepy music cue, no cartoonish menace. He's polite, calm. He even seems helpful. A little desperate in his own way, he's playing the same coy game Ellie is. There's just something a little off. Maybe he's just a little too smooth, a little too composed with a bow pointed at him. The game plays with that ambiguity too. For a moment, it almost suggests a new dynamic, as the duo are put through a scenario that we've seen plenty of times through the game so far. The horde fight through the sawmill certainly had me thinking maybe David is going to be the next Tess, or Henry, or Tommy, on my first playthrough. In fact, the game keeps David around just long enough for you to wonder if this is the new main pairing. After all, as I say, that sawmill fight mirrors the same kind of companion combat sequences we've seen throughout the game time and time again. Covering each other, calling out threats, surviving together. This might just be me, but David actually feels more useful than many of the other companion pairings you get throughout the game. There were so many times in the horde fight that he saved me from a grappling runner, or handed off some spare ammo for the rifle. Which makes sense, it was his after all. I'm saying it's familiar, intentionally so. David fits, uncomfortably maybe, into the slot Joel left behind. He's not as likable, but it's the same silhouette. Maybe I'm really naive and you saw through him straight away, but I was definitely tempted into thinking, maybe he's alright. But no, of course, that illusion doesn't last long. Because David isn't Joel. In many ways, he's his opposite. Joel uses overt, obvious, muscular violence to protect. David, on the other hand, uses kindness as a mask to manipulate. He doesn't need that same brute force to dominate. He hides control under charm, wraps threat in civility. But when the mask slips, what's underneath is terrifying.
You see, everything happens for a reason.
What follows the sawmill is probably one of the most disturbing stretches in the game. The initial attempt to draw David's men away from the barely alive Joel transitions from Ellie riding a horse through a breathtaking gauntlet of nameless goons to a stealth-focused sneak through a ski chalet and its grounds. Eventually, of course, Ellie is captured, locked in a cage, and David transitions from one disgusting kind of proposal to a somehow even more unsavory one. But, and this is crucial I think, Ellie never becomes a damsel. She fights, she provokes, she plans. She escapes the cage and fights through the snowstorm to save herself. She survives, not because Joel shows up in time, but because she refused to be broken. It's great character work. It shows us a little glimpse into the survival mode that Ellie will switch to so often in the second game. But for all the great stuff in the winter section of the game, it also has one of my least favourite parts of either game. Let me explain. The boss fight with David inside the burning steakhouse is mechanically interesting, at least in theory. It echoes for me the Arkham City Mr. Freeze fight, a stealth-focused offering that requires outpositioning the enemy in order to score takedowns. In practice, though, my feelings on it are a little muddier. David's AI doesn't always follow a logic I personally can comprehend, and some of the deaths in this sequence felt a little arbitrary. Maybe I just never really understood what the game was asking of me, but it's especially cruel and punishing when Ellie is felled in a single hit by a man who seems to smell her fear through walls. The Mr. Freeze fight in Arkham City is, more than anything, a kind of stealth systems victory lap for that game. It doesn't just make use of the mechanics, it showcases them one by one and then takes them away. You can try dropping in from a gargoyle. It'll work, once. You can hide under the floor and strike from below, again, simply once. You can use a sonic batarang to lure him in for an explosive wall takedown. It's a clever trick, but it won't work again. What makes the encounter so effective for me is that it forces you, and by extension Batman, to think laterally, to squeeze every creative option out of the whole of Batman's toolset. It's about adaptive stealth. You're not solving a problem so much as staying one step ahead of someone who's actively trying to solve you. Freeze doesn't patrol like a typical enemy, he hunts. He learns. Each successful hit you score tightens the design space until what felt like a sandbox becomes something closer to a chessboard, limited, deliberate, and tense. If you've been getting too comfortable with any one trick through the stealth sections of the campaign, Freeze is where that crutch gets kicked out from under you. But rather than feel punishing, for me it feels like a great teaching moment. The rhythm of that boss fight, if you can call it a fight really, is one of constant reinvention. What else can you do? What haven't you tried? There's a satisfaction to it, not just because you win, but because you win differently each time. Maybe it's fitting, from a meta perspective, that Ellie only has one way of surviving the encounter, but it's not mechanically satisfying. Again, maybe I'm just playing it wrong. But still, the point isn't the fight itself, I suppose. It's the outcome. The harrowing outcome. When Ellie finally gets the upper hand, when she turns the tables and buries that macheted in David again, and again, and again, the game doesn't blink. There's no glory, just firelight and fury. A primal, horrifying catharsis that feels almost too raw to watch. It's one of the most visceral and violent moments in the game, because of what it costs. The last shred of the childhood she'd been desperately clinging to, and she's claiming revenge for losing it just as much as she is over-ensuring her survival. Then, just when it seems that she might never stop, Joel appears. This will shock absolutely no one, but I'm a long-time admirer of Noah Caldwell-Gervais and his work as a video game critic. His depth of thought, his writing style, and his command over his delivery are things that I value immensely and hope that I can somewhat emulate in my own work. But there is a small part of his Last of Us critique, specifically his take on Joel's role in the winter section, that never quite sat right with me. He frames Joel as something of a returning savior, re-entering the story just in time to pull Ellie from the fire. And I get the impulse behind that reading, but I think it misses something crucial. What's satisfying about winter, at least for me, isn't Joel's return. It's Ellie's survival before that happens. She gets herself out of the cage. She stalks and kills her way through the snow and the blood, and when it matters most, she faces David alone and ends it herself. Joel shows up after the violence is over, not to save her, but simply to hold her. He doesn't arrive in time to be the hero, and thank goodness for that. I think there's a larger conversation to be had about how violence, and especially violence committed by and against women, is portrayed across both Last of Us games. And no, I don't think the series always finds the perfect equilibrium between empowerment and spectacle. But on this point, I tend to agree with Part 2's co-writer Haley Gross, as she puts it in the Grounded 2 documentary.
There has to be fail states in video games, which means a character has to be capable of being hurt.
As for me, well, I'm a guy, so I don't really think it's my place to take a big stand here. But I will say this. If you're arguing that women shouldn't be shown committing or having violence done to them in games, you're basically saying women shouldn't be in these types of stories at all. And that just feels backwards, right? Like somehow in trying to protect minority groups, we end up limiting the representation of them at all, which seems like the opposite of the point. I don't know. Anyway, back to the story. When the game cuts back to Joel, he's methodically moving through what's left of David's crew. We're doing the same things he's been doing throughout the rest of the game. And for a moment, on my first playthrough, I felt that creeping dread set in. Was this going to be that stereotypical part where he kicks open the door and saves the day right on cue? Would we be asked to believe that Ellie's arc had merely been set up for Joel's triumphant return? But no, of course, that moment never comes. Ellie survives on her own terms. The rescue never arrives because she never needed one. And that, I think, is where winter quietly begins to pull us away from Joel. Just a little. It's not dramatic and it's not a clean break, of course, because we'll be seeing out the rest of the trip to the hospital firmly in his size 10s. But I think it's a gentle shift in gravity. For the first time, we start to see Ellie not as a person being carried by Joel, but as someone we need to start watching outside his orbit. And given where this story ultimately goes, I think that shift is retroactively necessary, and maybe it was deliberate. It's the game making just enough space for Ellie to exist without Joel, long before it really needs to. Sticking in the here and now, just for one more moment, it shows us how determined she is to survive just long enough to get to Salt Lake, how much it means to her, and therefore how much her perceived purpose means to her. The shift in playable character finally gave me the chance to view Ellie differently, to see how she behaves when Joel isn't around to get her out of the situation. And she's competent and violent in a way I couldn't have predicted but maybe I should have before this segment of the game. Ultimately, Winter is Ellie's Crucible, and she survives it on her own terms, showing us that she doesn't need Joel to fight her battles. She needs him to be her safe space, her comfort. This perfectly sets up the hospital sequence because it gives us a glimpse of understanding as to why Joel's actions go against who she is as a character and why she reacts the way that she will in The Last of Us Part 2. As I spoke about in the first video, if you really want to fully understand The Last of Us, you have to get to grips with its fundamental argument. That love is not always good. The first game is about love. The second game, I think, is the other side of that particular coin. Hatred and grief. But the first game is about love, and sometimes love is selfish. Sometimes it's destructive. The core of the story isn't about a cure for a mushroom zombie infection. Not really. It's about what it costs to love somebody in a world like this. Joel's love is a hammer. It shatters everything in its path. He kills doctors, lies to his surrogate daughter, and possibly dooms the entire species, all in the name of love. And Ellie, she doesn't even get to choose her fate. The girl who wanted to matter, who could have mattered more than anyone else, is robbed at the exact moment her decision would mean the most. All because of love. In a way, I think Ellie's character in the first game functions a little like a litmus test. The way you interpret her changes based on what you think about Joel. Is he a hero? Then she's the daughter he saved. Is he a villain? Then she's the innocent he stole a purpose from. Maybe he's both. I don't know. At this point, I've spent a lot of time talking about Joel Miller. And at the end of it all, I don't think I really know him any more than when I started this video series. But Ellie, her growth, her complexity, her vengeance, all of that will come. But in the first game, she's not yet the Last of Us. She's just the next one. The next in line to inherit the world Joel broke in the name of love. With that, let's leave The Last of Us Part 1 behind. We're into much murkier waters now. Let's start with this, a question. If you found out that someone lied to you to save your life, but in doing so stole your choice, murdered to keep you breathing, how long do you think you could live with that before it started to rot you from the inside out?
Okay.
That's where we find Ellie at the start of The Last of Us Part 2. She's 19 now, scarred, quieter. Living in Jackson, trying to settle into a life that should be idyllic. Friends, a new relationship, routine patrols, something approaching a normal life. We'll find out later that she's known about the hospital and what Joel did for a year or two. But the structure of the game cleverly obfuscates how much Ellie knows for the most of the first half of the game. All we know is that she is withdrawn. There's something unresolved between her and Joel. A history that, as I say, we the players don't yet know. That 4 years is a void to us at the start. And the mystery of it pulses underneath everything like a quiet, infected wound. Jackson itself is quiet and idyllic. There's routine here, community, laughter. People drink coffee, make jokes, argue over patrol schedules. There are children, chickens, someone is building a snowman. The apocalypse happened, sure, but here, it's almost forgotten. kids born in the town may never have seen an infected in their life. For Ellie, it's the closest thing she's had to a home since that boarded-up bedroom back in Boston. Maybe, perhaps ever. Here she has a place and a routine. She wakes up, late of course, she goes on patrol. She flirts, badly, with Dina. There's banter and awkward glances and that wonderful, horrible tension of being young and feeling something and not knowing what on earth to do with it. And for an all too brief while, we're allowed to sit in that, with her. We see a glimpse of who Ellie might have been, if not for everything that's to come. If you don't mind, I'd like to zoom in on the barn dance for a moment. I know, I'm jumping pretty far ahead, but hey, if the game can get a little non-linear, so can we. It's a scene the game will hold off for a long time. We'll get fragments of it through the early walk through Jackson with Jesse, brief descriptions of moments. Not a full play-by-play exactly, but just enough to piece together what went down. A messy, emotional night full of drunken kisses, a tense run-in with Seth, and some kind of argument with Joel. But to see the scene itself play out, we'll need to go there and back again. To Seattle, to settle things with Abby. The scene itself plays with a startling sincerity. It's tender, it's warm, it's romantic. It's about proximity and uncertainty, that quiet hope that maybe a moment means more than just a moment. Of course, we'll get into the farmhouse sequence a little later, the thing that contextualizes why we see this scene at all, but I wanted to put this scene in here because by then, it's tainted with the bittersweet, melancholy knowledge that this adventure isn't over yet. We see it in the game because Ellie is, as she'll do multiple times throughout the game, reflecting on memories before she does something to burn her life for her grief. What makes the barn dance stand out isn't just that it's beautiful, though it certainly is, thanks to those lovely string lights and the stunning level of detail being rendered. I know this footage you're seeing on screen is from my PS5, but the first time I played this on a 4-year-old PS4, I was genuinely shocked at what that machine was capable of. Anyway, the barn dance doesn't just stand out for its beauty. It's that we're seeing Ellie in a completely different context. Not bracing for impact, not patching wounds, just being. After too many hours of stabbing and shooting, Ellie's doing something much scarier. She's trying to read Dina's signals, trying to figure out if this teasing back and forth is just friendly or something more charged. And in that suspended moment, Ellie is more exposed than she ever has been. Emotional vulnerability has replaced physical danger, but it's every bit as fraught. It's intoxicating, not just for Ellie, but for us as players, because after everything she's endured, after the haunted, survivalist pilgrimage of the first game, and the bloody path we'll have carved through Seattle, we, like Joel, wanted this for her. A life. A kiss. A night that ends with music instead of blood. The scene feels almost dreamlike. Not in the sense that it's unreal, but in how sharply it contrasts with the rest of the game's emotional register. It's lit like the memory it is, like something already slipping into the past, even as we watch it unfold. Jackson works really well as an intro to this game because I think it lets us imagine, just for a moment, a version of this story where Ellie never really has to pick up another weapon again, where she becomes a carpenter like Joel, or a baker, or starts a tattoo studio in town with a goofy name and a moss-covered sign out front. There was a sequence originally planned for the early part of Part 2 that didn't make it to the final cut. It would have taken place just before the barn dance. Ellie wandering through a winter fair in Jackson, getting a fuller sense of the community around her. According to Neil Druckmann on the Last of Us podcast episode, They Should Be Terrified of You, Ellie, the scene was cut fairly late in development. The reason? According to Druckmann, it disrupted the pacing. It wasn't quite polished enough, and structurally, it slowed things down at a moment when the narrative needed to be tightening its grip. But personally, and this is probably why I'll never get to be a writer on a multi-million-dollar project, I can't help but feel the loss. Not just because it sounds charming, and it does, but because the core idea behind it feels, to me at least, essential. The fair wasn't just set dressing. It was meant to give texture to Jackson, to show us what peace looks like when it's not haunted by zombie infections or scavengers out for blood. And more importantly, I think it would have given that much more weight to what Ellie will ultimately walk away from. The barns, the booths, the laughter, the potential for a normal life. A life lived rather than survived. Showing us this, I think, would have grounded us in a version of the world that has something tangible for Ellie to lose. And that, in turn, would have made her pursuit of Abby feel even heavier, even more tragic. It's quite easy to say that Ellie is throwing everything away, but without more time in Jackson, I personally don't feel the everything. We're told it exists, we're shown fragments, but that missing scene might have let us live in it just long enough for it to feel real. Something tangible, something warm, something worth mourning. So yes, I understand why it was cut, but I still miss the version of the game where it stayed. Wait, can you miss something you've never had? But as I say, ultimately, of course, the early parts of The Last of Us 2 still work. And importantly, we do get that glimpse into a potential hopeful future for Ellie. And the fact that we could almost see that version of her is what makes what happens next so devastating. Because, of course, inevitably, brutally, Joel dies. And it derails everything. We've already explored it, so I won't linger long here, but he doesn't get to go quietly. Not off screen, not symbolically. He's beaten to death in front of Ellie. And in front of the player, and with that, Ellie's arc will pivot hard. From Jacksoner to Griever to something far more dangerous. An Avenger. She becomes that wild, survive-at-all-cost character from Winter in Part 1, except this time it feels permanent. There won't be any loving arms to fall into when the exhaustion hits. Not any she can really accept, anyway. Like an A24 movie, when the violence comes, and it really does, it's not with the poetic inevitability of myth. It's not rendered in abstract. It's rendered with the shocking suddenness of a brick through a window. One moment, Ellie is being teased about her new relationship, bantering with Jesse and awkwardly dancing around her feelings for Dina, and the next, she's watching everything she understands about safety, fairness, justice, be torn out at the root. Jackson, of course, will remain. The town doesn't fall, the people aren't scattered to the winds. In fact, unlike most blockbusters, the town was never under threat. That's not Abby's goal. Jackson's still perfectly there. But for Ellie, that sense of refuge, it's gone in that moment, shattered, irrevocably. She may walk its streets again. She may sleep in the same room that she once did, but the feeling, that illusion of normalcy, dies in that ski lodge. And it won't be returning.
I'm gonna find. And I'm gonna kill. Every last one of them.
That line from the trailer wasn't just a marketing hook. It was a statement for the game. It is The Last of Us Part 2 in many ways. Ellie's grief doesn't settle, it hardens. It calcifies. It becomes an obsession, and for me, the brilliance of the game's structure, controversial as it may be, is that it forces you to live in that obsession, to see it all, and to feel it erode Ellie, piece by piece. Joel was her father in every way that mattered. He was taken from her, and not in the abstract. Her agency was stolen from her again as she was held down and forced to watch. So her response, while horrifying, is also entirely human. She doesn't want justice, she wants revenge, a visceral, bloody answer to a question that never had one. But revenge is a blunt instrument, and it doesn't carve clean lines. It mangles everything it touches. As the player, we'll see that toll accumulate. Jesse, Tommy, Dina, the baby, Ellie's own sense of identity. She'll sacrifice everything over the course of the next 25 hours, and she keeps going anyway. Because Ellie needs that closure. She needs the violence to mean something, otherwise Joel died for nothing, and worse, he died while she was still mad at him. That heartbreaking see you around will never come to pass.
I'll see you around.
Yep.
And that's the real emotional shiv of the game. She never got the chance to forgive him. She was trying, she wanted to. That late night conversation on the porch, the one we don't see until basically the end of the game, that's the key.
But I would like to try.
And then he's gone. So her whole arc becomes about chasing something she'll never get. Resolution. You can kill every person involved. You can burn the whole world down. It won't bring him back. And it won't make the last thing you said to him any less painful. In the immediate wake of Joel's death, it's Tommy who steps up with what sounds like reason. He tries to talk Ellie down from the ledge of vengeance. Though, as it turns out, he's really just trying to get a head start. He plans to go after Abby and her crew himself. Maybe he just doesn't want his niece getting hurt, or maybe he doesn't want Ellie getting in the way. Ellie, of course, never buys the idea of moving on. She can't accept or stomach the thought of Abby still out there, drawing breath, while Joel is buried and gone.
You know what? I'm leaving tomorrow. And if you want to come with me, great.
You have no idea what you're walking into.
Dina never hesitates to follow Ellie on this path. There's no debate, no moral inventory or stock-taking. Everything is too immediate for that. Just the instinctive certainty of someone caught in the early gravity of young love. It reminds me, maybe unfairly, of Riley from the Left Behind DLC. That same beautiful, reckless belief. We can just be all poetic and lose our minds together. But beneath that romantic impulse is something harder, something neither of them is fully reckoning with yet. The weight of the violence they're signing up for. Because it's not just a journey, it's a commitment to doing harm, entering the shadow of the Valley of Darkness without a map, and at this stage, they don't entirely understand what that's going to cost them. After one of the more quiet, gut-wrenching scenes in the game, Ellie clutching hold of Joel's jacket, Maria offers a more reluctant kind of support, and something quite unfair and selfish. I really wish the games had a little more time for Maria because, on the face of it, she commits two young people, one of whom being her niece, to a path of violence and death without any real reckoning or responsibility. Anyway, Ellie and Dina set out, unaware of just how much of themselves will get left behind. Seattle will leave deep scars. Day one in Seattle is, oddly, the most hopeful part of the journey. Or at least, it allows the space for hope. After the emotional detonation of Joel's death, still fresh in the player's mind, there's a quiet kind of determination in Ellie. She's not deranged or unhinged yet, but she is focused, angry, but still herself for now. And the game itself reflects that by briefly flirting with a looser structure, giving you a map and saying, go, look around. And while you look for fuel to open a gate, you do. Because it's beautiful here in Seattle. There's rot and rust and ruin, yes, but also greenery growing out of stone, sunlight glinting off glass. A bank tells the story of a couple bank robbers on Outbreak Day. An old music store with untouched guitars still somehow in tune. It's one of those moments that The Last of Us Part 2 does so well, the kind that slips in quietly and leaves a mark long after it's gone. One of the quieter storytelling tools in The Last of Us Part 2, and for me one of its most effective, is Ellie's journal. It's certainly not flashy, it doesn't unlock secret content or lead you to hidden upgrades, but as both a diegetic quest log and a deeply personal artifact, it acts like a slow unfolding biography. A fragmented record of who Ellie is at any given moment in the story, and more tellingly, who she's trying to be. Plenty of games use journals or codices to keep track of quests and events, Red Dead Redemption 2 being one of the more elegant recent examples. But The Last of Us Part 2 folds that device into its narrative muscle. It lets you walk through Ellie's thoughts, page by page, as she tries to make sense of what she's doing, what she's lost, and what she might still be trying to hold on to. Often it's just sketches, sentence fragments, attempts at writing lyrics, and the emotional debris of a scattered mind. At the beginning of the game, when Ellie's still in Jackson, the journal is warm and alive in a way that feels almost alien to the rest of the game. Knowing what's to come, there's the flush of a teenage crush, the embarrassment of romantic misinterpretation, the sheer adolescent thrill of thinking someone might like you back. It's all silly, sweet, and painfully self-conscious. More than anything, it's human. It paints a picture of a girl who's been given enough space to dream stupid dreams, who has for a moment what she once thought was lost to the old world. There's even a little bit of that George Lucas circular poetry here. In part 1, Ellie found an old teenage diary in the farmhouse, full of boy talk and school dances, and she laughs at it, baffled that such trivialities once mattered. And now here she is, obsessing over the exact same things. It's a quiet sign of the life Jackson has given her, a life rich enough that romantic awkwardness can feel like the biggest thing in the world. But then, of course, as the story shifts, the journal shifts with it. After Joel's death, Ellie's entries become sparser, harder, more fractured. You start to see reflections of the long journey from Jackson to Seattle, entries that, in isolation, might look like travel notes, but in context reveal a mind struggling to stay anchored to something. Ellie starts recording the days in a tone that feels more like obligation than anything else. Even in the still moments, there's tension underneath the calm. Ellie is still capable of joy, still able to marvel at something beautiful, like the horses, still able to love Dina, but that joy now comes with a cost, a penalty. If she stops hurting even for a second, she feels like she's betraying something. Her guilt sits effectively in the margins of nearly every page, every scribbled note. But still, love and tenderness slip through. She notices Dina's cold, which is obviously nice foreshadowing for Dina's condition. She wants to do something nice for Dina, and she appreciates the way Dina traps jackrabbits, smiles at wild horses. But it's all wrapped in that growing cloud of dread. The entries show someone trying to hang on to scraps of softness as her world hardens around her. That's the thing about grief, about depression, about emotional pain of any kind, really. It isn't cinematic. It's not one long, uninterrupted darkness. There's no ominous cello cue to signal that now is when you're grieving. It sneaks in and out of your day like bad weather. And sometimes, often, it doesn't even announce itself. My own experience with depression mean I identified with Ellie a little more than I expected to be honest. Because what The Last of Us Part 2 gets right, eerily right really, is that grief doesn't exist in isolation. It doesn't arrive and sweep everything else off the table forever. It coexists. It lives alongside joy, beside warmth, in moments that should be comforting, but now carry a bitter aftertaste. Ellie's journey is defined by that coexistence, by her inability to fully experience love without grief whispering something acidic into the back of her mind. To really demonstrate that, I do want to focus in on that moment in the journal where she writes about watching Dina smile at some wild horses. For a second, she forgets everything. She's happy. And then the guilt comes in. Real guilt. Like joy was some betrayal she didn't mean to commit. To be honest, these scattered notes generally hit harder than most of the game's violence ever could for me. Because that's how it works, right? You feel guilty for smiling. You second guess moments of happiness. If I'm capable of feeling any amount of joy, you tell yourself, how can I be depressed? How can I be grieving? And that guilt is its own kind of pain, wrapped around that original one, like barbed wire around a bruise. That question loops endlessly, stupidly. If you can feel anything good, then how bad can things really be? I still haven't found an answer to that question. I think part of the reason it's so hard to accept these contradictions is because we've been trained by culture, by media, to expect grief to look a certain way. The usual shorthand, days in bed, curtains drawn, no appetite or empty eyes. And that's true sometimes. Sometimes depression really does immobilize you. Sometimes grief really does take everything. But more often, it's a spectrum, a tide. You still go to work, you still make dinner, you still laugh at jokes and kiss the person you love and appreciate a well-drawn sky. You just don't quite feel there for most of it. Or you feel like you shouldn't be there. Like you're pretending or masking. You're told to buck up and shake it off and you'll be fine. For me, that's where The Last of Us Part 2 becomes so brutal and so honest. Not a shotgun blast. And not because it dramatizes grief, but because it doesn't. It embeds it in the in-between spaces, in Ellie's journal, in Ellie's reluctance to say how she feels, that sudden sharpness in her voice occasionally. Grief in this game isn't a monster. It isn't a metaphor, as much as a part of me desperately wants to see an artistry, to say that it's just like the cordyceps infection or something along those lines. But no, it's a condition. It's there when Ellie wakes up. It's there when she finds a guitar. It's there when she lets herself laugh and then regrets it. And to see that portrayed with such restraint, with no real declaration, no cliched "I'm broken" speech, well, it feels rarer than it should. Haley Gross and Neil Druckmann have written something incredibly beautiful with Ellie's journey in Part 2. At least these early parts. Another of those quietly impressive things The Last of Us Part 2 does, And it's easy to miss because it's not shouting for your attention, it's how its level design tracks the emotional state of Ellie. I'm probably running the risk of looking too much into this, but I hope you'll bear with me while we walk this thought trail for a minute. There's a kind of psychological cartography going on, where the layout of the world maps almost directly onto what's happening inside her head. What I mean is, Day 1 in Seattle is the most open the series has gotten. An almost open-world interlude with just enough space to breathe, explore, and detour. The guide rope tether of the narrative goes slack, and we're allowed to really breathe in these early moments in Seattle. It's telling, I think. Ellie, at this point, hasn't fully succumbed to the darker currents pulling at her. She can still share a joke with Dina. Her world, internally and externally, is still expansive, still filled with possibility. She could still call this crusade off. But Day 2, as we'll look at in due time, things start narrowing. Literally, I mean. The environments grow tighter, more focused and less forgiving. You're being funneled now, pushed forward. And Ellie is too. Her grief starts calcifying into that vengeance. She spends more time alone. Conversations drop away. Dina fades from the frame. Rage steps in to fill the gap. By Day 3, she's practically a ghost, silent, cold, slipping further into a version of herself that only knows how to chase. The fact that Naughty Dog ties that into gameplay without putting too much attention to it is a small masterstroke. You don't always notice it while you're playing, but I think you feel it. Or maybe I am just really looking too much into it. Who's to say? In an old, gutted music store in downtown Seattle, Ellie finds what some folk call a guitar. It's been battered by time, dust, moisture, like everything else in this city. But, miraculously, it still plays. So naturally, she sits down. She delicately takes the body of the guitar with a practiced ease. She tentatively plucks at the strings. And she sings. The first few lines are from Future Days, a song Joel played for her once, back when life still had soft moments. Back when the idea of a future, however small, still meant something. It's a song I think we'll talk about a little later, because here, in the music shop, she doesn't get far. The memory maybe is too close to the bone, and it slips away before it can finish. That song isn't for now. Instead, she shares the moment with Dina, with a song from their past, shared at a campfire scene we're never privy to. It's a take on Me by a-ha, an 80s upbeat classic, which, on paper, probably sounds like a strange tonal match for a game so drenched in grief and decay. But in context, it's perfect. Ashley Johnson's performance isn't polished or confident, it's fragile. Tentative. And that's exactly why it works. Really, there's no performance here. It's a memory being coaxed out one chord at a time. For Ellie, this isn't a spontaneous love song for Dina. It's a tether. A thread back to something safe. Something real. Joel taught her to play guitar. This song in particular carries his fingerprint. An 80s song that he very well may have introduced Ellie to. A song from his own youth, being passed through time to her. It's one of our only glimpses into the version of Ellie that he was trying to preserve. Someone who could live in a world where music mattered more than survival. And in a way, I think this song is Joel speaking through her, so far from home, even if she doesn't say his name. In retrospect, the scene feels almost impossibly delicate, like it should be kept under reinforced glass. It's the last moment of unbroken peace before everything fractures. The last breath before the plunge into the hellscape that will be Seattle. And the game wants you to hold on to it too, because from here on out, softness well, we're leaving softness behind. There may be guitars later, but not like this. There's something else I want to mention briefly here too. The moment also echoes something we've seen before in other games. Most notably for me, that basement sing-along in Bioshock Infinite, where a cover of Will the Circle Be Unbroken cuts through the noise of violent revolution with a sudden, crystalline stillness. It's a trick borrowed from cinema too. James Gunn does this a lot in Guardians of the Galaxy, letting classic tracks do the emotional heavy lifting for a scene. But something that The Last of Us does that is very rare to see, it doesn't use the music as a needle drop, a moment for you to put the controller down, to walk away from the characters. It makes you play it. That physical act of strumming, of picking the notes, of taking the time, I don't think it's just for atmosphere. It's for immersion. It's to tell you, the player, to take a moment, to slow down, and remember. And it works, because long after the blood has dried and the credits have rolled, long after you've spent your last shotgun shell, it's this moment, I think, that lingers in my mind more than any shootout. Just a girl, a guitar, and a song borrowed from another time that reminds her of her dad. Holding onto something good before it all goes bad. These moments matter in The Last of Us. Their tonal contrast and their moral landmarks. Because it's in these moments that you remember who Ellie could be. The rest of day one is mostly following in Tommy's bloody, vengeful footprints. The Saravina Hotel, the TV station. The leads are thinning, the trail is bloody. Nick, Jordan, Leah, every name Ellie crosses off the list comes with a mess of collateral damage. As day one in Seattle winds down, after a frantic escape from a zombie horde, just to remind you, of course, that this is still a horror game, Ellie and Dina find shelter in an old crumbling theater. The building creaks and groans like it's remembering what it used to be. Grand curtains, a packed audience, a few gasps and laughs in the dark. Even in its decay, there's something comforting about it. It's not home exactly, but it feels like one. At least, more than the corpse-strewn streets outside ever could. The theater becomes a kind of base camp throughout the game. A space where things slow down just enough for the characters to breathe, to reflect on the day, and for the player to take stock of the emotional weight being dragged behind. Personally, I've always loved old theatres. Growing up, my favourite was the Market Hall Cinema in Bromore, South Wales. A tiny red-seated pocket of nostalgia where I first saw Harry Potter, Star Wars, and High School Musical 3. You know, those formative touchpoints for every millennial that's just now feeling the rust of age settling into their joints. That last one wasn't my idea, of course. I hadn't seen the first two, so it was a very strange experience of Troy and Gabrielle's romantic epic for me, catching up in media res as their star-crossed love affair hit turbulence. Or at least, that's what my increasingly hazy memory recalls. My younger cousins were insistent, and I was trying very hard not to be the boring older cousin. I failed, obviously. I'm still deeply boring and uncool, but hey, at least the popcorn was good. Anyway, where was I? Back to the apocalypse.
I can't get you infected if that's what you're worried about. I can't make you immune either.
There's that survivor's guilt, boiling under the surface, making itself known. Then Dina has her own bombshell.
I think I'm pregnant.
That's wonderful.
I really like the pregnancy conversation. It shows Ellie still has that tether to her humanity. On hearing the news, on hearing that Dina is pregnant, she has this to say.
We could have still turned back.
At this point in the story, Ellie hasn't fully crossed the line. She's still capable of choosing love over vengeance, at least in theory. We know what's coming. Just a day later, when faced with the choice to either go after Abby or help Tommy, well, she doesn't even hesitate. Her need for revenge wins out.
Okay, I didn't want to be a burden.
Well, you're a burden now, aren't you?
But even here, that more acidic side, that side of Ellie that will throw everything away for violent retribution, that comes out too. Even Ellie seems taken aback by what she's just said. She doesn't exactly apologize, she just walks away visibly uncomfortable. Ashamed, maybe, but certainly not remorseful. It's as if part of her is terrified that Dina's pregnancy could jeopardize the mission, could derail her pursuit of justice, or vengeance, more accurately. That tension between the Ellie who still loves and the Ellie driven by rage is what makes this scene so emotionally loaded. The fact that it comes almost exactly at the halfway mark of Ellie's half of the story, well, that's just icing on the cake. As the dust settles in this new home base, Ellie finds another guitar, and once again the game slows. She plays Future Days by Pearl Jam. Finally, we get it in its entirety, a callback to a flashback from earlier in the game, that one we were just talking about, where Joel played the same song for her. This time, though, it feels a little lonelier. The lyrics, "If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself." For some, I think they're probably a little saccharine, maybe corny, but I'm a cornball. I love it. The lyrics cut through Ellie's grief like a scalpel, because of course she has lost him, and she is losing herself. Everything about her grief plays out in this act of remembrance, in those few tentative plucks of the guitar strings. Joel, for his part, whatever you may think of him, didn't just protect Ellie, he shaped her, helped her find beauty in something other than survival. I think the guitar was his way of saying, you're allowed to care about something else. And now that he's gone, she's clinging to the music, because it's the only way she still knows how to talk to him. Lines like, "Everything I have found, dear, I've not found by myself," and "Did something out there here," feel like they were written for Joel specifically. As though Eddie Vedder somehow read the character brief before recording the track. Of course, he didn't. Vedder wrote the track about a friend who had tragically drowned a year before the release of Lightning Bolt, and that loss, that grief bleeds into the song. In that way, it's not just a licensed song dropped in for some cool points. It's a core text. It's essential to The Last of Us Part 2. A quiet, plucked lament for what's been lost and what still might be. This song, this last fragile connection to Joel, will later be weaponized by the story's closing chapters. The song's lyrics look for better days ahead. Future days where two people can be close together. Future days that Ellie and Joel were working toward sharing together. Putting their past behind them and turning over a new leaf.
There you go.
Well, that didn't suck.
But for now, it's just a moment. A small one. But small moments can matter more than big ones when they're this carefully placed. The Last of Us Part 2, even more so than the first game, offers very few shafts of light, amidst its overwhelming darkness. But one of the brightest of those, and the one I'd like to focus on, is the flashback at the end of day 1. Ellie's 16th birthday trip to the Wyoming Museum of Science and History. It's not a coincidence that this particular flashback that concludes day 1 is one of love. It's the last breath of something beautiful before the long suffocation of days 2 and 3. At this point, Ellie still has her tether. She still has a sense of herself, uncorroded by vengeance. And so, at the end of day 1, she reflects. Not on bloodshed or trauma, but on one of the most joyful memories she has. I think the museum sequence quietly undoes that colder, crueler interpretation of Joel that I was talking about in video 1 from the end of the first game. That he loved Ellie more for what she symbolized for him, rather than for who she was in herself. Here, in this scene, he shows just how well he knows her, how much he accepts and embraces her, and wants to show her that he loves her. He takes her to a place tailored exactly to her personality. For her birthday, he gives her a surprise that isn't big or loud particularly, but it is still deeply personal. This isn't the Joel who selfishly robbed her of her agency in that hospital. This is the Joel who's paid close attention to her, who's listened to her, who remembers who she is, what she likes. Their banter on the way in, on that walk through the forest, Ellie joking, Joel playing coy on what her surprise is, it's warm and familiar. It's exactly how we remember them from the best moments, the brightest moments of that first game. They'll playfully push each other into the river, wander through dappled sunlight, and for a minute, it's as if the world never ended. And hey, just as a side note, Ellie can apparently swim now. Joel finally got around to teaching her. And we can finally say that there'll be no more palette puzzles. A small mercy, sure, but a meaningful one. Even the game's mechanics acknowledge the growth of their relationship, the things they've grown beyond, and what I, as a player, couldn't stand from the first game. As Ellie keeps guessing at her surprise, Joel just tells her not to ruin it, grinning that closed-off dad grin that somehow says everything. And then they arrive at the museum. Her excitement is so audible, so visible, and so childlike. Because inside the museum, Ellie is a kid again. She's sprinting from one exhibit to the next, teasing Joel about being older than fossils, poking at ancient bones. And Joel gets into the role of fun dad for a change. Upstairs, she sees the space exhibit, and we're treated to maybe the most iconic moment in the game. Ellie's love of space isn't just about planets or asteroids or the cool factor, I don't think. Well, it might be that too, but I think it's about what space represents. Freedom, curiosity, possibility. That Star Trek idealism. I mean, not what Star Trek is these days, I suppose, but that original mission statement. A hopeful look to the stars, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, and to boldly go where no one has gone before. That idealism is a stark contrast to the world Ellie grew up in, the one that's given her almost no hope. Joel gives Ellie a recording of a rocket launch to listen to inside that lunar lander. It's such a small thing, and yet, in this world, it's enormous. To think of how much work he must have put in to find it. It's clear how deeply Joel knows her. The way her mind works. What would truly matter to her. And we get treated to a wonderfully animated moment. Focus on Ellie's face inside that fishbowl helmet, reality drifts away, and we see the stars. As I say, this moment is the last clean breath of fresh air before the deep dive into grief and rage that'll define the next 2 days in Seattle. It's placed at the end of day one for a reason, to remind us what's been taken, and to anchor all of Ellie's pain in something real, something good. This is who she's fighting for. Joel, the man who once gave her the stars. Ellie was angry at Joel when he died, and rightfully so. He denied her the sense of purpose she'd built her identity around. He made that decision unilaterally and never apologized for it. And yet, here's a man who clearly knows her, who loves her. He also gave her a new life in Jackson. A life with Dina, Jesse, with Tommy and Maria, and a community. The most safe and normal that life can surely get in this world. A life that she'll end up burning, lost in grief and self-destructive rage. From day 2 onward, the story descends. It gets colder, bloodier. Ellie becomes harder to look at, and, to be honest, harder to be. Because the game asks us not just to witness her descent, as it would in a TV show or a film, but to act it out, to take ownership of it. From this point on, there's very little levity in the game, and that's on purpose. I don't think the point is to enjoy the ride. It's to see and feel the cost. That's why the later flashbacks, especially the one where Ellie confronts Joel about what he did, hit so hard. Her present is so bleak, and her memories start to turn with it. The game's non-linear storytelling isn't a gimmick, or at least it isn't to me. It's that emotional architecture. Love is non-linear. It's complicated. It contradicts itself. You can be furious with someone and still miss them every day. The museum provides us with a beautifully bittersweet farewell to the reflective type of mourning that Ellie has been quietly undertaking throughout day 1. By day 2, her grief has become everybody else's problem, and things are beginning to curdle. Seattle has started to lose its charm. As I mentioned earlier, the wide-open exploration of day 1 has given way to tighter, tenser spaces. Encounters feel more brutal. One encounter that I'd be remiss not to mention occurs right at the start of day 2. Hillcrest. One of the standout combat sequences in the game for me, and probably you too, and it's arguably where The Last of Us Part 2's refined mechanics really snap into focus. Hillcrest itself is a lush neighborhood, in a way that feels almost ironic. It's overgrown with vines, ferns, and all manner of vibrant greenery. And underneath that emerald canopy, there'll be a lot of bloodshed. As I say, Hillcrest is the section of the game where you really feel the leap in gameplay from part 1. Where the first game toggled between discrete states, by that I mean stealth until you're seen, and then shoot until it's quiet again. Part 2 tends to blur the lines between those binary states. It's a continuous flow state. You sneak, only to be flushed out by a tracking dog. You run and break line of sight, vault through a broken window, grab a bottle, double back, and suddenly you're behind someone who thought you were 3 streets away. While I'm talking about them, the dogs are a brilliant addition. Not just because they change the pace, though they absolutely do, but because they make staying still feel dangerous in a way that it wasn't in that first game. They're a soft push against the corner camping that tended to dominate the encounters in the first game. In Hillcrest, the gameplay of Part 2 really crystallizes, and the idea is clear: keep moving or die. And the violence, it's something. The shotgun tears through enemies with grotesque force. The impact is less cinematic, more forensic. Limbs go flying. Red mist hangs in the air after a well-placed headshot. Bloods and bits of skull matter splatter walls. And your enemies have names. That small detail, someone screaming "Dave!" after a brutal headshot, grounds the action in something uncomfortably human. Again, in a way that the first game didn't. In a way, it's quite hard to explain why The Last of Us Part 2 feels so much better to play than the first game. It's a lot of little things that don't sound like much in isolation, but really add up to being more than the sum of their parts when seen holistically. So the naming thing, right? You're not just clearing out hostiles like you were in the first game. You're killing people who had friends, who had been having conversations 5 minutes before you arrived, who knew what they should have been having for dinner that night. You'll kill people that linger in the background of Abby's story later. It adds weight to the brutality without ever fully pulling the trigger or moralizing about it. It just lets it all hang there. And the one that really lingers for me will come a little later. At the hospital, when you can potentially kill a dog and someone calls out the name Bear. Well, let's just say that Abby's day one in Seattle retrospectively makes me feel very disturbed about this particular encounter. The gameplay leap in The Last of Us Part 2 isn't about a grand reinvention. There's no headline mechanic that I can point to that fundamentally changes the genre, no pivot into a different style of game. As I say, I can't point to any one thing as proof that Part 2 is a superior game. What Naughty Dog delivers here is what the best sequels do. It iterates. It's a game built on the principle that enough small, intelligent changes can amount to something familiar, but ultimately improved. Take the prone mechanic. On paper, it's hardly revolutionary. Lots of games let you lie down. But here it recontextualizes a lot of the play spaces. Being able to go prone isn't just a new movement option, it's a new language of approach. You can crawl through tall grass, slip under trucks, navigate through collapsed floorboards, or create unexpected angles of stealth and attack. It encourages you to think about the level, not just in terms of cover and sightlines, but in terms of layers. The above, the in-between, the below. It fosters a much closer, more physical relationship with the environment, which in turn fuels the tension that the game thrives on. The sense that you're never quite safe, never quite in control, but always just improvising your way through. And importantly for the narrative, it makes you feel as endangered and inconsequential to the wider world as the characters would in each scenario. Similarly, the dodge mechanic initially reads as a small addition, a single button press in melee. But it's in that moment when you're toe-to-toe with a hammer-wielding Seraphite that it becomes clear just how much has changed. Combat in Part 2 has an intimacy to it, a closeness that feels almost nauseating. You're encouraged into those melee encounters. And the camera tightens. The animation feels scrappier. Each blow lands with crunching, uncomfortably believable weight. You're no longer trading bullets from cover, you're reacting to every attack. Dodging right as a blade whooshes past your head, countering with a desperate, lethal strike of your own. This design innovation didn't happen in a vacuum, of course. In the Grounded 2 documentary, the developers talk about Bloodborne as an influence. Not a mechanical copy, but in philosophy. They were drawn to the idea of aggression and responsiveness, of combat as a fast, desperate thing. At one point, apparently, they even considered sidelining firearms entirely in favor of a melee-focused experience. While that didn't happen in the end, the influence clearly lingers. The melee rhythm isn't as exacting or stylized as Bloodborne, but it's not meant to be. It's messier, uglier. The rhythm suits the world of The Last of Us just fine. It's not about precision, it's about survival. In The Last of Us Part 1, combat often felt segmented. Areas were frequently designed as stealth sections until the moment you were caught, at which point they became shootouts. You were playing with two discrete systems, and the handoff between them, the seam, was visible. Part 2 erases that seam. Combat is more fluid and continuous. You sneak, you're seen, you flee, you double back. You vanish, reappear, and strike again. The system never breaks, it flexes, and it rewards creativity. It often invites it. What makes these changes so compelling to me is that none of them are particularly showy. The prone button isn't flashy. Dodging doesn't reinvent melee combat as we know it. Improvements to enemy AI isn't really something you boast about on the back of the box. But together they build something denser, more responsive, and more alive. The second game, doesn't reinvent the metaphorical car from the ground up. It's just polished the hubcaps till they're gleaming, it's smoothed the previously rough suspension, and lets the ride speak for itself. It's really something you need to play and experience for yourself. Back to the story, Hillcrest is also where Jesse re-enters the picture, fresh from Jackson and almost instantly caught up in Ellie's personal war. It's a surprise reunion that doesn't waste time on sentimentality. Jesse is all action, pulling Ellie into a high-octane escape sequence that sees the two tear through enemy lines in a battered truck. It's fast, it's punchy, and the set-piece work is top tier. Vehicles crash with real heft. The gunfire feels lethal. The camera stays tight and handheld, not quite a shaky cam, but close enough to make you feel the chaos. Day 2 also introduces the Seraphites, whistling zealot archers that stalk you through the overgrown wilderness like something out of The Wicker Man, by way of Children of the Corn. Up to this point, the conflict has been largely personal, Ellie's personal revenge tour through Seattle. But now, with the introduction of this other faction, we zoom out slightly and realize Ellie's walked into a conflict that has absolutely nothing to do with her. The Seraphites, or Scars as they're more dismissively called by the WLF, due to those ceremonial scars they carve into themselves as a show of faith, they aren't looking for Ellie. Not yet, anyway. They're hunting their own enemies in the dense parkland around the hospital. WLF soldiers are their targets. Ellie is just a complication. The Seraphites are the game's most striking new enemy faction, and they'll really define Abby's journey later. But right now, I think we're most interested in them from a mechanical perspective. What I mean by that is, they change how you play. Up to now, enemy chatter has served a gameplay purpose. The WLF calls out names, positions, and their tactics. Even when you're hiding in a bush with half your health bar blinking red, you're gathering intel. But the Seraphites? Well, they whistle. High-pitched signals whose meaning are utterly opaque to Ellie, and by extension, the player. For the first time in a while, you're deaf to the world again. Even your detective vision, listening mode, is rendered mostly redundant by the Seraphites. They move so quietly that a lot of the time, their white outlines disappear entirely. The whistling communicates a sort of cold coordination, a shared language outside the player's reach. And that alienness underscores a broader theme of The Last of Us Part 2, I think. Ellie is not the center of this world. Her story matters to her, and to us, of course. But out here, in the wilds of Seattle, she's just passing through someone else's apocalypse. It's a clever shake-up of the gameplay. That growing player fluency, learning to read the AI's behavior, preempt movements, capitalize on tells, it's all reset in the park. You don't understand these people. They don't understand you. It's alien, eerie, and deeply unsettling. Their weaponry reinforces that feeling. The WLF soldiers use guns, of course. Clean, familiar, military. The Seraphites generally prefer silence and suffering. Wounding arrows that stick out of your body until you find cover and manually remove them. Enormous melee weapons that feel like they were ripped from some medieval executioner's storeroom. Combat against the Seraphites is more deliberate than anything else we've really experienced in The Last of Us. More painful. You're pushed even harder into stealth, hiding in waist-high grass, ears straining for the snap of a twig or the faintest whistle. Those brief moments, their white highlights return. By this point in the story, the violence has become something like muscle memory. We've killed so many people in so many ways that the act itself feels automatic. Like mashing R2 to reload, even though half the magazine is still available, or impulsively checking the map for the 100th time. On my first playthrough, I remember somewhere during the infiltration of the hospital, it hit me just how high the body count had gotten. And we're still only on day 2. The stealth mechanics are excellent, tightly tuned and satisfying in isolation, but there's a relentless churn to the combat, a kind of weary grind, punctuated by deeply upsetting animations that weigh heavier than they ever did in the first game. For all that, I think I like Part 2 just a little more than the first game. Not in a way that always makes sense while I'm playing, just in a way that sits with me after the controller's down. Incidentally, Abby's half of the game doesn't quite provoke the same existential fatigue, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get there when we get there. As I tried to put a finger on the difference, why this game feels so much more exhausting despite being built from such similar parts, I came to a tentative answer. For much of the game, when you're playing as Ellie, you're not surviving like you were in the first game, you're invading. You're the one kicking in the doors and clearing rooms. The mission begins ostensibly from a place of grief and justice. Find the person who killed Joel, something we can all get on board with. But somewhere along the way, that rationale is frayed. Unlike the first game where violence mostly existed in the name of protecting Ellie, here it exists in the name of punishing, well, everyone. Ellie's grief gets sprayed over Seattle until the city itself is drowning. The tone shift is subtle. I'm not entirely sure I'm explaining myself very well here, but it turns every kill into something more morally ambiguous than anything in the first game. You fill the shoes of less reluctant survivor, more traveling war crime, I guess. You know, we're not conflicted when Ellie kills all of David's crew because they're cannibal maniacs. We can't really say the same about the WLF. I think there's more to say about the game's biblical runtime later, but for now I'll just float the idea that it could lose half its combat encounters and gain twice as much narrative weight. Sometimes less is more, especially when more means 40 dead WLF operatives in a hospital lobby. What I'm trying to say is the game's relentlessness, that grimness, on day 2 particularly, started pulling me away from Ellie and her quest, emotionally. Somewhere in the depths of the hospital, knee-deep in corpses and fluorescent lighting, I started to feel less like I'm playing as Ellie on this journey with her, and more like I'm just watching someone I used to know unravel. She has every reason to leave Seattle by this point, and yet, here we are. The confrontation with Nora solidified that transformation for me, but it's not without rocky writing issues. The scene starts with Ellie announcing herself, giving Nora the full dramatic build-up, that Ineo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die speech, almost. But what follows highlights a recurring issue I have with Abby's entourage. They're loyal to a fault, in a way that, for me, never felt really earned. I guess I'd call it unreasonable loyalty. Not because the loyalty itself is a problem, it makes sense that they've been lifelong friends, but we never really get to know these people, before or after Joel's death. The only member of the crew we get to spend any real time with is Manny, and he's little more than a macho pastiche of a soldier, all oorahs and ladies' man ridiculousness. Nora, for her part, even goads Ellie about Joel's screams. I initially thought we'd get a moment of reflection, or regret. It looks like it. Maybe she might even attempt to apologize to Ellie. But then Nora, a medic, someone whose job presumably involves valuing human life at its core, decides that what she most wants to do is gloat to the psycho holding a gun on her. Someone who's traveled hundreds of miles to get to her, and she gloats about how great hearing Joel's screams in her dreams is. It's an absurd thing to say generally, and for me steers the encounter in such a wrong direction. That said, the chase itself is as tense and well choreographed as you'd expect. Leaping over hospital beds, slamming through doors, winding down narrow corridors, smashing through glass windows in the relentless pursuit for answers to Abby's location. It's the kind of sequence that reminds you this team knows how to choreograph intensity like few other game developers. I haven't spent much time on individual combat encounters in this game, despite liking a large majority of them. Partly because doing so would double the length of this already wildly overlong dissection, and partly because, well, most of them, while well designed, start to blur into each other after the 50th silent takedown. But one that stood out, lit dramatically by red flare light, involves a chaotic three-way standoff between the WLF soldiers, clickers, and Ellie. It's one of those rare moments where the enemy factions stop pretending you're the only threat in the room. Everyone's fighting everyone, chaos reigns, and you're just trying to navigate the crossfire without getting torn apart by teeth or by bullets. It's tense, brilliantly paced, and for a brief moment it feels like the game is shaking off its usual structure and just letting the systems breathe. Unfortunately, this kind of encounter is the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, the game partitions its enemies into neatly labeled boxes. Now it's the Seraphites that we fight, now the Infected, and in this little sandbox, we'll fight the WLF. They're kept strangely insulated from each other, which is a shame because when the factions do collide, the game becomes something far more dynamic and unpredictable. Narratively, this particular set piece functions as a kind of strange detour on the way to Nora. It doesn't add much to the story directly. To be honest, it actually pulls you out of the building momentum, but in isolation, it's a highlight for me. Like a deleted scene that turned out better than half the main plot. Okay, so the final encounter with Nora. It's certainly one of the more iconic visuals in the game. Deep in the bowels of the hospital, the darkest, dankest parts. Ground zero for the Seattle outbreak, a fungal tomb. A fitting place to be poetic and lose one's mind. The chase through so many levels of the hospital has led to a dead end. Spores hanging on the air like moldy ghosts emanate from the corpses of unfortunate explorers. It's a short sequence, but it's visually dense, moody, atmospheric, and more than a little damp. The Ground Zero wing really hints that there's something stranger, darker, more eldritch about the cordyceps than we've seen so far. There's an almost Lovecraftian bent to the whole thing, a promise fulfilled on Abby's trip into the abyss. But that's for another time. Walking through those dark, fungus-infested corridors leads into a final confrontation in a room bathed in sickly, angry red. A single light pulses like a warning, or maybe a heartbeat. Either way, it's not subtle, and that's fine with me. Subtlety is not the currency this scene deals in. I wonder if visually this scene is a callback to the first game's final moments. Another hospital, another red light. Though this time, Ellie's not being carried out of the proverbial fire, she's walking straight into it. Nora, by this point, is already dead in a long-term sense. Infected by the spores Ellie's immune to, she's on a short clock. But it's not quite short enough. Ellie needs answers, and when Nora doesn't give them up, well, Ellie picks up a pipe. The game, in one of its most effective moments for me, turns the screen inward. We don't really see what happens next. Not because the game's sparing us at all, but because it no longer matters whether we watch Nora. It's more horrifying in what it chooses to show and what it chooses to obscure. The camera lingers instead on Ellie's face. Focused, trembling, somewhere between wrath and collapse. And then it hands us the prompt. Press square to get the information you need. It's one of the rare times the game denies us a visual. But after all, this is about Ellie, her rage, her pain, her conviction. When we see her next, she's gasping, trembling, horrified at herself. And if I'm being honest, I'm a little horrified too. This was the goal, wasn't it? Information, justice, closure. But none of those things seem to have arrived. Through day one, Dina was right there beside you. She supported the mission, even if she didn't fully understand it. And in doing so, by being there, she softened it all. She breathed a little bit of humor into that early, expansive exploration of Seattle. Dina, in this game, is Ellie's tether to her humanity. Those little moments, exploring the synagogue together, messing around in the music store, they gave Ellie something to hold on to. And they gave us space to breathe, to settle in Seattle. There's obviously still moments of violence on that first day. This is still a game where people get stabbed in the throat with astonishing regularity. But on day one, a lot of it happens off screen. We come across bodies already cooling. Tommy's been through there first, doing what needs to be done, and generally we're left with more aftermath than action. That certainly doesn't make things, pleasant exactly, but it softens that edge. But on day two, Dina fades from the narrative a little bit. Sidelined by her pregnancy, she steps out of the action. She's still there at the home base, still trying to reach Ellie in those moments you return to the theater, but she's not beside Ellie anymore. The game infrequently injects Jesse to try and keep that even keel, but as I say, we tend to have Ellie isolated more often, and the violence takes more of a center stage. I don't think it's a coincidence that the real, aggressive, muscular violence comes on those later days when Ellie's on her own. This isn't the horse-ridden trail up to Seattle anymore. That hopeful tone that kicked things off, the whole ride off to save Tommy energy, that's long gone by this point. And we're not done yet. Before we hit rock bottom, before we move through to day 3, I'd like to take a second to reflect on something that I mentioned earlier. Flashbacks, or memories. As I mentioned a little while ago, day 2 offers us 2 flashbacks that get increasingly darker. Appropriately so, as they reflect the shift that's taking place in Ellie's present. One after we get back from Hillcrest, and one after the hospital. The one after Hillcrest starts as a hunting trip with Uncle Tommy. A routine patrol that involves practicing with a sniper rifle and taking out a handful of wandering infected. It's one of the few times we actually get to hang out with Tommy, to let him be a character for a little while. But the main point of this flashback is spending a little more time with Joel. A trip to a music store for new guitar strings, which ends up in a beautiful abandoned hotel fighting a bunch of zombies. Same old, same old. Ellie is noticeably distant with Joel from the start, short with him, and reluctant to go on the trip to the store without Tommy as a companion. As a buffer, maybe. On the scenic horseback trail, Joel tries to bridge the distance the only way he knows how, by appealing to their shared history. And luckily it's one that the player will be familiar with too. I guess it really is lucky that they haven't developed any other inside references in the intervening years between games. He pulls out some savage Starlight comic lore on the trail, maybe hoping they'll serve as emotional duct tape. Ellie doesn't really bite. And just as a side note here, I haven't actually mentioned it yet, but Shimmer. This flashback shows us that Ellie's had this horse, well, long enough that the game probably should have let her mourn Shimmer's death on day one. But I guess we're on a schedule. Vengeance waits for no horse. To get to the music store, they cut through an abandoned hotel, and you can practically feel the game wink at you. It's dimly lit, spores hang in the air, and mushrooms are doing their best impression of wallpaper. You know what time it is. We've done this 100 times. This whole stretch plays like a nostalgic callback to the first game. Joel and Ellie doing Joel and Ellie things. Sure, the roles are reversed now, we're Ellie and Joel is the AI companion. But the beats themselves are familiar. Creeping through rooms, quick stealth kills, and of course things quickly devolve from stealth into a brawl. A couple well-placed shots, a few precise stabs with our knife. Hey look, we even saved Joel for once, and the hotel is quiet once more. But just like a video game, one wave of enemies, well, it just ain't enough. By the time the hotel finally actually quietens, we've piled up an incredible number of bodies for a flashback. As if that weren't enough of a callback, we also get a boss fight with a bloater. Hey, it really is just like the first game. It's a little more dynamic this time, with the new dodge mechanic and all, and the bloater himself can now barrel through walls to get at you, to make the fight feel somewhat new. Joel himself gets a cool new finishing move. That surely would have been handy in the first game. As I say, this whole flashback was starting to feel like a nice little reminder of the first game. If I was being cruel, I'd say it's little more than an overlong ode. To be honest, on my first playthrough, I was starting to get a little impatient, looking at my watch thinking, where is this going? That is until we find two Jacksoner corpses. And their journal. And we see the real reason we're getting this whole bit. See, the Jacksoners had left the safety of home because they wanted to help the suffering of the rest of the world. A noble and incredibly on-the-nose sentiment for Ellie to stumble upon, and give her an opportunity to air her suspicions about Joel's explanation at the end of the first game. If you were ever in doubt, this flashback is here to hammer home that Ellie is struggling with survivor's guilt. Everyone who turns into a zombie from the end of the first game, well, she takes on her shoulders. After all, she should have been able to provide a cure with the Fireflies. Sitting alongside that survivor's guilt, her suspicions with Joel have clearly been eating at her this whole time. She asks some pretty reasonable questions, such as, why did you pull me away from that place? You know, after we traveled for a year and a whole country to get to it, while I was unconscious. Joel, just as at the end of the first game, has no compelling lie to tell. I mean, at this point he's had a couple years, and he still hasn't manufactured a better lie? Come on, Joel. As is becoming a theme for this video series, I really like the character work in these scenes, if only there was a way to get all this information across without a 30-minute interlude. The second flashback acts as a coda to the first. Or to put it another way, the first is the setup, and the second is the twisted punchline. The second one is, thankfully, far less involved on the player's end too. It's short and to the point. Ellie has run away from home. She's gone on pilgrimage. She's gone seeking truth. Somehow she's gone all the way back to Salt Lake City, to the hospital where the first game ended. The doubt was eating her alive in Jackson, I guess. She had to know what Joel had done. And wow, does she find out what Joel did. I already addressed this scene in the last video with Joel, from Joel's perspective, so I'll try my best to be brief here. Essentially, this scene is the culmination of all those moments throughout the game. This flashback contextualizes exactly why Ellie was so off with Joel, why Maria was concerned for her at the start of the game, and why Ellie's grief is so volcanic, and her retribution in Seattle so extreme. Because after years of doubting her father figure, knowing he was lying to her, but not knowing what the lie was, Ellie went all the way to the hospital in Salt Lake, the old base of the Fireflies, and she found a tape. As you and I know, on that tape was the hope for humanity. Proof that she was the cure for mankind. Proof that she did indeed have a purpose. That her life meant something. And that, in a moment of pure, selfish love, Joel, the person Ellie loved more than anyone else in the entire world, had stolen her purpose. I could say more, but honestly, what's left? The acting and the tight script work do all the heavy lifting. The hurt that Ashley Johnson imbues in Ellie, and the pain that Troy Baker gives Joel, it's more than enough to make this grown man cry. If you've made it this far into the game, it hopefully broke you a little too. So let's leave it there. Let's delve into day 3. I say delve into day 3, but truthfully, there's not a lot of delving to be done. It's mostly a string of perfunctory encounters, routine scuffles with increasingly tired-looking goons who feel less like threats and more like obstacles in a particularly violent obstacle course. Shoot, stab, burn, repeat. At this stage, the combat is a dance whose choreography I've memorized and grown pretty tired of. And there's a whole other campaign to go. There's another bloater fight, too. This one staged in a admittedly wonderfully atmospheric, rotting arcade. To be fair to the game, it's a pretty inspired and very cool location for a grotesque boss encounter. There's something poetic about all that colourful childhood nostalgia, dulled and decomposed here, of course, being stomped into mulch by a mushroom-encrusted Hulk. But can I just say, why are there so many bloaters? Across both games, I mean. It feels like they were meant to be this mythic, once-in-a-blue-moon encounter. At least, that's how the first intro fight felt. To be honest, I was hoping for something like The Last of Us' answer to Resident Evil's Mr. X. But somewhere along the way, they got downgraded to semi-regular mini-boss. They're supposed to be terrifying, but by now they're basically just big, angry ammo dumps with legs. Day 3 also hands you the keys to a little motorboat, letting you surf the sunken streets of Waterfront, Seattle. It's a novel set piece, to be sure. Wet, windy, and vaguely apocalyptic in that unique Pacific Northwest beautiful kind of way. But, and I'm sure you're sick of me saying this, but it feels like padding. Like another scenic detour the game just didn't need. If the point was to underscore how long, hard, and soul-scraping the road of revenge has been, well, trust me, message received. Several miles ago, in fact. I've been hunting for an emotional off-ramp ever since. As was often the case in the first game, the goal remains constantly visible as we travel. This time around, it's Abby's last known location, thanks to Nora's information, the aquarium. Always just out of reach, always framed by the acts of carnage that you commit. The finish line never felt so close, and yet the race never felt more exhausting. The aquarium, though, even in this blistering storm, even as our little boat gets tossed around like a bath toy in the hands of an angry god, is an oddly beautiful sight. Half ruin, half refuge, it clings to the decaying Seattle waterfront like a barnacle. Later, of course, we'll see it from Abby's perspective, as a kind of sanctuary. She and the remnants of her people have retrofitted this decomposing marine exhibition into something resembling home. For Ellie, though, it's none of that. It's not a haven. It's not a home. It's little more than a destination, a target, a blood-stained red X on her map. The Pacific Sea itself seems determined to halt our arrival, trying to push us back, force us to abandon this folly, asking in increasingly urgent tones, "Are you really sure you want to go this way?" But not even drowning would stop Ellie's vengeance now. She'll rise from the sea to the shore as a vengeful spirit. When she finally breaks in, after a couple small puzzles of course, the game feels quieter than it has in a long while, despite the raging storm outside. There's no music swelling, no dramatic score at all really, pushing you along. There's just the soft slosh of water underfoot, the creak of old beams and the long, slow search for Owen and Mel. It's a moment stretched thin by dread. We know what Ellie's here to do, of course, and so does she, but knowing doesn't make it easier, does it? Through nondescript corridors, ancient sea life enclosures, Ellie will creep. Through a room filled with medical equipment, bloodied instruments, gauze half unwrapped and left mid-use. I really like those small details. The things that Ellie comes across that mean nothing to her, but through context, through playing Abby's half of the story, we get it, you know? To Ellie, this looks maybe like something sinister. Medical experimentation, deranged doctors, something like that. After all, the only medic she's met so far from Abby's crew was Nora, and that ended, well, poorly. When the confrontation finally comes, it doesn't play like a climax, does it? It plays more like a mistake. As she's done so many times in Seattle over the past 3 days, Ellie has stumbled into the middle of something she doesn't really understand. This time, an argument between Owen and Mel. Heated, pointed, and clearly the product of some long-standing fractures. There's a sense, for a fleeting second, that Mel might give Abby up, just to end it. But Owen won't. Whether out of loyalty, love, or desperation, he lunges for Ellie's gun. It's a fatal miscalculation. Mel charges next, less with tactical precision than raw emotion. Loyalty to Owen, maybe? Or just a terrified, instinctive reaction. A quick jostle with a knife, and it's over. 2 bodies lie on the floor. No boss fight, no chase through SeaWorld. Nothing we'd expect. We're little more than an audience to Ellie's lowest moment. It's only after the dust settles that Ellie realizes what we, the player, will be learning at the same time. Mel was pregnant. Even without that, though, this moment doesn't feel heroic. It should. After all, this is the end of the quest we've been on. Most games would be celebrating right now, celebrating the player's triumph over the plot. But here, it barely even feels like revenge. It's just a mistake. A moment of panic and self-defense. Somehow, Tommy swoops in to keep the plot moving. to stop it really sinking in just how far Ellie has sunk. I won't question the plot's logic too much, but wasn't Ellie choosing between saving Tommy and seeking her revenge? In the end, she could have saved Tommy and lost, what, a couple minutes? I know the practicality doesn't really matter. It's more about the symbolic meaning of her choosing her revenge over her family. But to be honest, it does grate a little more than maybe it should that Tommy and Jesse turn up literally 10 seconds after Mel and Owen meet fate. But yeah, instead of letting us sit with what Ellie's tunnel-visioned quest for revenge hath wrought, the game whisks us back to the theatre. Home, sweet home. Okay, before we move on, if you'll allow, I've got to go back into pedant mode for a second. I do like the imagery of the blood pooling up to Ellie's map, in a poetic sense. You know, that blood and consequences are coming to haunt Ellie for what she's done. But, practically speaking, I absolutely can't stand the contrivance that helps Abby come after Ellie's home base. If she'd left behind all her gear in the chaos, you know, that might have worked. Panic, trauma, total disarray, I'd buy it. But for just the map to tumble free, land face up and lead Abby directly back to the theatre? Well, now you're pushing the limits of my suspension of disbelief here, game, and I like you. I'd honestly prefer a Pulp Fiction style Butch and Wallace just happen to be passing in the streets type of thing than what was ultimately landed on here. As it stands, it feels like the writers knew where they needed the story to go, but not quite how to get there. So they just kind of, you know, tossed the map on the floor and hoped we wouldn't notice. Unfortunately, I can't help but notice. There had to be a cleaner way to set up the theatre showdown than this oddly convenient bit of clumsiness, surely. But here we are, squinting at bloodstains on a map and pretending that makes some sort of sense. Anyway, back at the theatre, things are winding down, I guess. The leads have run dry, we've gathered the party. Tommy, Jesse, Dina, they're all accounted for. So, it's time to leave, to go home. Jesse and Tommy, at least, are planning the trip home. Ellie, rather than reflecting on every splinter of her soul Seattle has stripped, is still wanting to push. You know, even still, even if she can see that there's no real option to do that. So, time to go home. Real home, I mean, to Jackson. Except, of course, the game and Abby have other ideas. In a flash, Jesse is swiftly murdered, Tommy, similarly, gets shot in the head. It's all reached a critical point in a brutal confrontation with Abby herself. It's certainly not the revenge fantasy climax Ellie was chasing, or perhaps that we had imagined. It's a terrified, messy, abrupt confrontation that doesn't end with that catharsis, as we'd wanted, but with Ellie begging for her family to live. Abby lamenting giving Ellie a chance to live, and Ellie wasting it, and a cut to black. Because Abby, of course, gets her own story. It'll be the subject of my next video. A cut to black, and just like that, the cycle of revenge collapses inward on itself and the game rips the floor out from under us. So what was it all for? Ellie's 3-day descent through Seattle wasn't about hunting those responsible for taking something irreplaceable. Not really. It was about what she became in the process. The person who once played guitar in a music shop for the girl she liked is now something different. Quieter. Haunted. I guess that's the trick Seattle played on us. We thought we were chasing justice when we set out from Jackson on horseback with Dina, but all we were really doing was measuring how much of ourselves we were willing to destroy in the name of a ghost. We're jumping ahead a little bit. We're leaving Seattle in the rear view. I'll talk a little more in depth about the theater and the climax in Seattle with Abby. After all, it's her perspective we inhabit during the gameplay of that whole sequence. The farmhouse sequence is one of the most emotionally taxing stretches of a game that is, by its nature, emotionally taxing. After hours of relentless combat, escalating brutality, and emotional attrition, after the confrontation with Abby. After defeat, the game gives you a reprieve. No clickers, no crafting bombs in the middle of a firefight, in fact, no cover-based gunfights at all. The game jettisons a good 90% of the gameplay it's built up and relied on, and lets you live out your own little house on the prairie fantasy, if for a little while. Thinking about it now, in the first video I criticized the first game for never letting the emotional scenes breathe, without needing to throw a shootout in. In particular, I'm thinking about its own little farmhouse scene. It had this deep-seated anxiety that players might disengage if they weren't given a gun and something to point at a staccato 30-second interval. This farmhouse sequence, by contrast, well, it feels like the perfect comparison and a juxtaposition. It's like the games finally trust us, and it's part of why I find myself loving the second game more than the first. Because it would have been so easy, right? And probably tempting too, to have a corny sequence where the fence is broken and some zombies have come for JJ. Ellie needing to pull out the revolver, load a round into the chamber, and start blasting to save the baby. Or, maybe some strangers come to the ranch in the middle of the night and we get a Wild West-style shootout. The imagery is about right for something like that to happen. The sun-drenched Wyoming landscape, the wide-open fields, the creaky barn. Thankfully, it never comes. Is it too much to say that the farmhouse alone puts Part 2 on top of the first game for me? Maybe. It's just silence, sunlight, and the slow, almost meditative rhythms of domestic life. It's exactly the kind of digital holiday I needed after going sleepless in Seattle. I said defeat just now, but Ellie has in theory won, right? Abby let her go after all. Again. She survived Seattle. Jesse didn't. Tommy barely did. Dina nearly didn't. And somehow, through the bullets, the bloaters and the bombs, Ellie has landed here, at a postcard-worthy farmhouse, helping to raise Dina's child, looking after cattle, doing the kind of manual labor that might, in another story, be healing. Dina, for her part, is trying. Really trying to choose happiness. She's planting roots, building a life, turning away from the violence they barely escaped. And who can blame her? Ellie is trying too. If you remember, hours ago now, back when we were in the first day of Seattle, I talked a little bit about how grief and trauma and all of those things, they're always with you. But just sometimes, they linger under the surface. A gun waiting for something to pull the trigger. Well, these scenes at the farmhouse are so effective at showcasing just that. Sometimes you put on a brave face and you try to dance with the person you care about most. And you try to be okay. But Ellie, of course, is not okay. The trauma of Seattle sits just off camera in every scene. She's withdrawn when we check back in with her on the ranch, staring at Joel's broken watch, before JJ's gentle cooing breaks her out of her stupor. She'll put on a record and coax Dina away from washing dishes to have a little dance with JJ in her arms. She'll herd sheep into the barn. A little lamb trapped in the back of that barn triggers one of the game's only jump scares. I'm not usually a fan of jump scares in horrors, to be honest. They're so often cheap lazy adrenaline triggers that serve as the amateur's crutch where they can't generate true, lingering dread. A replacement that tricks you into thinking something was scary, though you'll have forgotten it before long. Am I being harsh? Maybe. They have their place in horror for sure. So maybe I'm just scarred from the late noughties, early tens conjuring copycat horror cinema and that irritating violin sting. Here though, I'll allow it, because the barn scene is truly terrifying, and not one anyone playing the game is likely to forget in a hurry. That dread that I'm talking about, it's been lingering under the surface. When the PTSD breaks through in the form of a panic attack caused by a shovel falling and clattering on the ground, it's terrifying, really terrifying in its realism. Ellie's brought right back to that moment. She's reliving that day in that snow-battered ski lodge. She's trapped in it, helpless against it, hearing Joel's cries for help. The first sign that this little adventure, well, it's not over yet, is it? Dina is, as she was in those early parts of Seattle, Ellie's tether, her route back to reality, away from the nightmare, back to the barn. Just sitting quietly while the panic slowly dissipates. We all need a Dina every once in a while. This next little bit, Ellie with the rifle slung over her shoulder, this is where on my first playthrough I really thought we'd be rudely pulled out of the domestic horror into something more, cliched. A Red Dead style shootout. As I say, it serves as the perfect locale for a Western standoff. Turns out the game subverted my low expectations to offer something far more effective. Because it's not a shootout that turns up. It's Tommy. Limping, bitter, and newly alone, having lost everything in this fight too. Since returning from Seattle, Maria has apparently left him, and whatever was left of Tommy has clearly been eaten up by grief and guilt. And you know what? For one last time, I just have to say it. This scene would hit so much harder if we actually knew Tommy. The scene still works, but it works in spite of that gap of knowledge. It works because of how well Ellie is written and animated in the scene, how much we know her, not because of Tommy. He's stuck, like Ellie's stuck, but where hers has been mental, his is clearly physical. Too injured to keep chasing Abby himself, too angry to let it go. He's been following leads for, well, he says months. The game doesn't specify exactly how long it's been since Seattle, and honestly, JJ, to me at least, looks a little too big for months. I'm no expert in baby aging, but he's firmly in toddler territory now, right? This is actually the first time in the series, to my memory anyway, that we haven't been given some kind of structural time marker. The first game had its seasonal shifts. This one has used days, obviously. Days 1, 2, and 3 in Seattle. And it's labeled flashbacks with helpful timestamps. But here, nothing. It's strange, right? If anyone has any insight into why that choice was made, I'm all ears. Anyway, Tommy's come a-calling because he's got a lead on Abby's whereabouts. Or at least, someone built like an ox and a kid with scars. And he wants Ellie to finish what he couldn't. Presumably not just to complete what they started, but to make all of this horror worth it. Which is, in its own way, weird, right? Because if you remember, in Seattle, Tommy seemed like he was ready to walk away. He even asked Ellie if it was okay that Abby got to live. Maybe that was a bluff. Maybe the head injury scrambled something. Maybe, I guess, he thought he could live with it, and discovered, in the long silence afterward, that he couldn't. Either way, it doesn't change the now, and now he wants Ellie to fulfill her grief-given promise of revenge.
Reckon it's easy. Forget about her. You sitting all comfy way out here?
The cruelty Tommy is able to conjure and spew is genuinely quite shocking. There's something childish about it too. He invokes this idea of a promise, and when Ellie doesn't agree to honor it, he storms out like a petulant kid. It's also a kind of weird thematic callback. Remember, it was Maria who originally sent Ellie and Dina off in the first place. Reluctantly, I guess, but still. She asked two traumatized teenagers to find her husband, essentially sending them into unknown danger to soothe her own fears. Now, Tommy's doing the same thing, only more selfishly, and with even less regard for what Ellie's already endured. Dina, thankfully, isn't having it. She chases Tommy off, protective of the fragile little life she and Ellie have built here in the countryside. Maybe now, Ellie can finally choose peace over revenge. Maybe she's learned that chasing ghosts only ever ends in pain. Maybe. Or maybe Tommy just put a metaphorical, loaded gun on the kitchen table. By moonlight, Ellie picks up the guitar. And that means, of course, it's flashback time. It's become a kind of structural motif at this point. Ellie strums a few chords, memory floods in. But this time it's not Joel she's remembering. Back in Seattle, the guitar was a vessel for Joel's memory. His songs, his voice, his absence. It was how she stayed tethered to him. Here, though, the notes she starts to pick out are the opening of Ecstasy by Crooked Still. It's not Joel's song, it's Dina's. It's the track that played under their dance at the barn. The key moment that sparked their relationship, long before Seattle tore everything apart. And once again, music becomes the game's emotional scaffolding. It's the thread that connects past and present. It's memory, meaning, and motive, all in a melody. There's also a quiet inversion happening here, isn't there? In Seattle, flashbacks and music were fuel for Ellie's vengeance. They reminded her of what was taken from her. They justified the pain she was dealing out. But here at the farmhouse, it's the opposite. The music, the memory, this is her reason not to go. This is her reason to stay, and still, she chooses to leave. It's an extraordinary stretch of storytelling. Quiet, intimate, and brutal in a completely different register than the game's more overt violence that we've gotten used to.
I don't sleep. I don't eat. I'm not like you, Dina. What?
The whole thing on the farm is only 25 minutes of the total 25-hour runtime. And yet, even after all these years, it's the one part of the game I love most of all.
Stay. I can't.
It frames Ellie as someone deeply broken, unable to reconcile love with loss, peace with guilt. The farmhouse isn't the resolution, not the ending that we wished it was. It's a crossroads. And Ellie takes the wrong turn. It's time for some California Dreamin'. By the time Ellie, and us the player, reaches Santa Barbara, I'm tired. Not just in the long session gaming sense, though I'm certainly guilty of that too, but in a deeper, more existential way. By this point, I've spent hours crawling through the emotional wreckage of Seattle, walking with characters who are steadily unraveling, watching people I care about destroy themselves for reasons that have long since lost clarity or meaning. So, when the game ripped me out of that picturesque Jackson farmhouse and drops me into a sun-drenched, palm-lined coastal town and tells me there's still more pain to work through, I can't help but sigh. Especially that first approach through the town as Ellie, the sight of clickers and runners at this point. Yeah, I'm done. The game, mirroring Joel's finale in the first, I guess, gives me a machine gun. And I just don't want it. Now, okay. To give the game its due, Santa Barbara is, on paper, an intriguing final act, a sort of coda to the main events of the game. I can definitely appreciate a lot of what it's doing with hindsight, and more importantly, distance. The Rattlers, a new faction introduced in the 11th hour, have built a kind of Mad Max light fortress out of a former vacation resort. Their aesthetic is grimy and cruel, with enslaved infected chained up like guard dogs. Certainly one of the game's cooler mechanical flourishes lets you unleash them on their captors. Something that might have felt cathartic if I could bring myself to care about anything that's happening at this point in the game. It all feels a little hollow now. Everything does. The combat, still tight and polished, but it feels perfunctory here. The stakes, once intimate and human, now just feel punishing. It's not that this part of the game is poorly made, mind you. It's as high quality as everything else we've seen so far. It's that I personally have already been emotionally emptied. Your mileage may vary, you may not feel this way. But I certainly do. Maybe that's intentional though. Ellie is exhausted. Abby is certainly exhausted when we find her. The story is in some sense dragging itself towards the finish line on hands and knees because that's the only way it can end. It's hard to imagine the game closing on the quiet grace of the farmhouse. Not because that wouldn't be emotionally compelling, but because it wouldn't be emotionally complete. That moment needed to be interrupted. Because this is a story about the price of revenge and trauma. And your pain doesn't just vanish when you walk away and close your eyes. It follows you. It waits in the dark. Still, I wonder what might have happened if Naughty Dog had found a different structural solution, I guess. Santa Barbara, as I say, feels like a coda. I can't deny it's important, yes, but separate, detached. I don't know if releasing it as a standalone DLC would have been financially viable. Probably not. Charging extra for the emotional resolution of a 25-hour narrative is, rightly, a hard sell. But the idea lingers for me, artistically. Would it work better with the definitive siloing, the intentional separation that a different game mode would bring? The game isn't too long in a technical sense. I've played a lot of 100-hour plus RPGs in my life. I've recently completed my 5th playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 following Patch 8's release. Yes, I'm quite behind on game releases. So I'm not averse to a long game. It's that The Last of Us 2 specifically, I think, is too long for the emotional discipline it expects us to take. I feel like I've already finished the game long before I actually see the credits. The finale, when it comes, feels like relief more than resolution. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the story had to overstay its welcome to some extent. Maybe you're supposed to want out before the characters do. Thinking about it now, maybe in the end it's not about revenge at all. It's about the exhaustion of grief. What happens when you've burned through everything and still feel empty? What do you do when you finally win and it doesn't feel like you've accomplished anything at all? I don't have an answer to that, by the way, but Santa Barbara doesn't satisfyingly answer my questions either. Bruce Straley, the game director on the first Last of Us game, said, quote, "We feel that the interactive medium has an untapped potential to touch the feelings of the player. You have that connectivity. The fact that you're actually in the world, it gives us some sort of advantage to make you feel connected to what's happening. At Naughty Dog, that's what we're trying to do, is pair story and gameplay together. If we can make you feel like you're actually with these characters on that journey and you're invested in those stories, then you're feeling, in theory, the same thing that they're feeling. End quote. And that effectiveness is part of what made the first game so absorbing. It's what made us love those characters so much. But it's a double-edged sword because it's part of why I feel by the end of the second game, despite how undeniably great it is to actually play, I don't want to be part of it anymore. That whole final stretch with Ellie, everything we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, the farmhouse, the trek to Santa Barbara, the fight with Abby on the beach, she's a shadow of the girl we once knew. Too embittered to give up now that she's come this far. By the time Ellie reaches the final stretch, the farmhouse, the trek to Santa Barbara, the fight with Abby on the beach, she's a shadow of the girl we once knew, too embittered to give up now that she's come this far. But just before we get to the beach, there's one last weird thing to talk about, isn't there? There's been a couple of those recently, I'm sorry. But the weirdness I'm talking about is the scene with the prisoners in the Rattler camp, where Ellie becomes their accidental liberator. As I've been writing, recording, and editing this whole video over the last couple of months, this one tiny little scene has been sitting with me, to be honest. I've known I've had to say something about it, I guess. But for the first time since I started this project, I'm truly, genuinely stumped. I have no idea why this scene is here. Why we needed one final speed bump on top of the already pretty sizable speed bump that Santa Barbara has been. It's so random and unnecessary. It sort of epitomizes every single other needless or flabby scene across both these games. We came to Santa Barbara for one reason, to finish things with Abby. But as it has so many times before, the game can't help but give us another little detour. Ellie doesn't know these prisoners, she's not here to liberate them, and yet she does. Is the game trying to frame Ellie as heroic? Well, we know it's not because of the next scene, at the beach, and how that frames Ellie in a rather more pathetic, lost light. It would maybe fit in the Uncharted games. You know, Nathan Drake suavely jumping in, saving a few people, cracking a few jokes. Here, it's another little momentum killer before the climax. Now, I'm sorry, but I truly don't understand why it's here. Anyway, momentum killer aside, we've made it. We've made it to the beach at the end of the world, and it's more horrible than we could have ever imagined. As I say, Ellie is at her most pathetic here, completely given over and lost in that need for vengeance. For a moment, when she first cuts Abby down from her makeshift crucifix, there's a chance at something, a flicker of mercy, forgiveness, redemption maybe. She saved the life of the person that took everything from her, ironically enough. They go to the boats together in silence, framed in sea spray and thick fog. Maybe Ellie has finally, eventually, after too long, put aside her need for pointless revenge. She even walks away to a second boat conveniently strung up on the shore. But of course not. A flash of Joel's bloodied face is enough for Ellie to tell Abby she ain't going nowhere. It's interesting that despite spending a lot more time with Ellie across both games, I'm firmly with Abby here.
I'm not doing this.
But when Ellie brings Lev into it, Abby can't stay passive. I guess I'm spoiling part 3 a little bit here when I say Abby's journey has been about finding something new to live for, and that's Lev. What follows is, I think, one of the most miserable boss fights I've ever played. One of the most inappropriate too. I mean that in every possible sense. It's not just that it's bleak, and it really is. It's just kind of awful to play as well. I've said it before, I love this game. I really, truly, deeply do. I wouldn't have dedicated all this time to this series if I didn't. But this fight makes me question that. It's nasty and sluggish and uncomfortable. It's also really basic. Just a couple of dodges and a couple of retaliatory strikes. There are only 2 points where I think this game genuinely crosses the line. Alice was one. This whole scene is the other. The image of Ellie sat alone in the fog and surf is an undeniably powerful one. And you know what? I think we could have had it without the fight. She could have let Abby go, and it would have worked just as well. But emotionally, I get it. This is the resolution to Ellie's story. This is the scene that picks up the thread left dangling back at the theater in Seattle, when she didn't win, and we didn't play as her. This beach fight is a grim rerun of that moment, but this time it's her turn, and we are playing as her. Her lesson? Revenge is bad. That's the big moral. I've tried really to come up with something sharper or more insightful or maybe witty to say, but honestly, it is just that simple and just that ugly. Joel's arc ends with what love looks like when it's at its most desperate and selfish. Ellie's arc ends when she accepts that the person she loved, the person that burned his life for her, he's gone. And nothing, no fight can fix that. Was it worth the beach? Not for me. But it's still a great place to leave her all the same. That final sequence of Ellie, alone in the farmhouse, slowly walking through its walls, that just before Santa Barbara felt like a home, now empty. She comes across the Crooked Still album from earlier. The one that features hers and Dina's song. Symbolic, I guess, of Dina having left for good. And she's unable to play the guitar Joel gave her. It's heartbreaking stuff. But maybe this is just me. But that final shot of her putting the guitar down and walking away, it's also quietly hopeful. You know, she's left everything behind, and maybe she can start again. I said that at the end of the first game, I didn't want a sequel. The ellipsis, for me, was more compelling. Now, I know part 2 proved I know nothing. The story diverged in such an unexpected but satisfying way, I ended up loving it far more than part 1. But at the risk of making myself look very foolish, I really don't want a part 3. Again, the ellipsis, the ambiguity of what happens next, it's more powerful for me. I think one of the things I've been walking around for this whole chapter is this. Ellie's path in part 2 is the painful journey of someone who's still trapped in their grief. There is no what's next for Ellie. Not in this story. Not until she literally has the person she hates most in the world in her grasp, at her mercy, and she can finally let go. I don't think that what's next is for us. It's okay to close the book here. I think it means more narratively that we don't know what's to come, because Ellie certainly doesn't. Ellie's journey that started way back in the first game, it's about the impossibility of growing up when your entire childhood has been defined by trauma. It's also been about what happens when you inherit someone else's violent legacy and take it on for yourself. It's also been about that painful, slow, imperfect process of learning that grief doesn't always get resolution. It's not as clean as that. It just becomes something you have to accept and carry, no matter how impossible that seems sometimes. Just like Joel before her, and as we'll soon look at Abby after her, Ellie isn't a hero. She's not a villain either. The Last of Us is too grey for that. She's just a person trying to make sense of an emotional inheritance that no one should have to bear. The story doesn't tell you how to feel about Ellie, and it doesn't judge her, I don't think, either. After 2.5 hours of talking with you about her, I certainly can't tell you how to feel about Ellie. The game simply walks you through everything she did, everything she lost, and then leaves you there, sitting with it, quietly. Uncomfortably maybe, but honestly. And that's why, despite a really rocky ending, one that comes real close to derailing the whole thing for me, The Last of Us Part 2 is so unforgettable. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.